Hello everyone, today we talk about the Latin locution Historia Magistra Vita. To conclude 2021, that has not been perhaps the best of years. Maybe we're seeing the end of what is going on, and as you know, we'll transition from some pandemic to endemic situation. But as we were saying also in that video on holidays, it's not really about the pandemic in itself, nor all what has been triggered just materially by that, by bad policies and or properly lack of organization, or simply the unforeseen in a way that you can never say. And this is part of today's topic, right? You can never say what is, whether it's just something random happening from the external, if you have something to do with that, which is always the case, right, in both directions. And I realized that I remember when I started Schwerpunkt, I think my very first video was something like, why is history important? And it was a very brief reflection on it, and we never addressed, I think even once, the term Historia, the locution in fact Historia Magistra Vita, which is instead quite famous, quite known, and in fact used, if not properly in the actual words, but as an idea of history, right? A kind of a erudite, but at the same time mostly admonishing or hieratic one, like history has all this, what we have built mostly ideologically around history. And the reason why I make this video specifically is that at some point in my life, when I began to study history, I actually rejected, as all young people in their iconoclastic phase, let's say, this, the factuality of the statement. I thought that there was something, at least in the way people that read it or interpreted it, that was incorrect, right? And by a certain degree, I still believe it. But on the other hand, in a more comprehensive view of history after all these years, I reappreciated it, and I would like to explain why and what I think that the phrase actually means, because also the etymology of the words is something crucial here. The way you translate and interpret things is maybe slightly different from the one the author, in this case, is, as you know, famously enough, it's Cicero in the De Oratore 2:936. And in fact, the phrase is taken from a broader period that goes by Historia vero testis temporum, lux veritatis, vita memoriae, Magistra vitae, nuntia vetustatis. That is to say, history is truthfully the witness of times, the light of the truth, life of memory, mistress of life, teacher of life as is usually in fact translated, and messenger of antiquity. And even in this translation, we should be careful, because the terms here are meaningful. So it's actually a bunch of ideas about history, and it's it's significant in a sense that of all the other definitions that are given in the period, only Magistra vitae, Magistra vitae, I pronounce it in the classical way. You can say Magistra vitae, it's the same. Magistra vitae, if you prefer, we don't really know how they really spoke, but at least this is Cicero's, at least it's the spring of ultra-classicism, and so maybe considering what we have reconstructed a little bit with the hard consonants and so on, the double a e, pronounced I, etc. But that's not a big deal. And the reason why I rejected initially the term, as I was learning of it ever since I was a child, as far as I can remember, was the following. You see, at the beginning, you really say, history is really mistress of life, right? She really teaches you what life is about. And the first meaning that is usually attached to this is in a sense, the idea that there are, at least this is a bit more the classicistic idea that we have matured. I don't know whether here we could say properly, I don't think it's much because of classical antiquity or even Cicero himself. Of course, the Romans at the time attributed great, importance to single historical figures, where of course they saw the the principle of action and of heroism, and therefore of the virtus and the that would deserve the imperium and so on. But let's say Cicero himself has become the authority over time. So since the Renaissance, and even before actually, and later on, this aura of, say, history as mistress of life, as teacher of life, I think was mostly interpreted, in fact, in this idea. Let's go back to see what the Greeks and the Romans did, and because the great men of in history lived at that point, there are these great examples, and indeed in classical historiography there was a big deal of of attention towards certain specific role models, right, in both in mythology and in history. So it was not strange, even in a classicistic sense, during the Renaissance, resuming the idea of the great figures and the great elements that would exemplify, would in fact show, teach, say, other humans, right, what humans can be and can do. And this is, an interesting approach, of course, because biographies are important, right? They are important, especially in the measure in which they show you what in fact a single individual can do. And history, especially when it's fairly objective and in fact real, because that's what history at the end of the day, where in another it is by approximation, because it's based on real facts. But it doesn't mean that it is true, right? But it's based on something that happened, right? Even when it's a fabrication, still it's the product of a specific time and perspective, right? So it's still rooted in that specific cultural context. And I know there are lots of people who say, history, it's all kind of a fake, it's a conspiracy. Other idiocies like, history is written by the winners or all this stuff. There is a lot of distrust in the world, I guess, not much towards history per se or the historians, but let's say the narratives that are used to interpret history. And part of the reason is, of course, that history is so large that everybody can, say, come up, say, with a perspective that is historically valuable in this sense as exactly a product of history itself, and that gives a bit everybody the illusion that their opinion are worth something just because they can't reference back to something like history that, generally speaking, is considered civilizationally an important thing, right? This may be the first time, well, not really in absolute terms, but let's say a pretty curious moment historically, in fact, when we have the possibility of learning history extensively and intensively by a certain degree, because really everybody can have a decent education, even autonomously acquired, and nobody gives a damn, right? There is this idea, okay, it's so easy to get that. After all, who cares? I prefer doing something else. I prefer entertaining myself rather than learning something new. And this is valid for many fields, not just history. The oversimplification of narratives is quite evident. It's properly the lifestyles that are pushed also in the market. The idea that you don't have to worry about anything. There is always something that is going to fix things for you, including thinking and reasoning. So essentially losing the very, you can argue that the very quality that makes you human, that makes you something else, that makes you reach beyond yourself, right, in the moment of the effort of the, even of the suffering, but of the work and of the achievement and the fulfillment. Unfortunately, history is too complex and complicated to act, meaning that when we talk about history, that my favorite, it's properly the moment of the inquiry, right? Then history can substantiate itself in many things, right? It's properly the memory or the discovery, the collection, the organization, the presentation, the interpretation, all these things. But at the end of the day, all of this passes through the inquiry. That's what the etymology of the term, as you know, in Greek means. So at the beginning, when you're a child, you kind of go by anecdotes, right? I had some kind of historical understanding at that time, but of course I focused in a sense towards the great figures of the past rather than the periods, the age, because that entails like a broader political and social understanding that age you just can't have. But you'd be surprised also by how much kids can be perceptive of these things. I must say that I have beautiful memories and ways. When I was in primary school, I was taught history, or at least, it wasn't even one of the most important things that I remember, etc. But I can distinctly remember that as kids we liked to create kind of a world on our own that had a history on its own that was kind of reflective of the historical one. And we created games that had to do with that. And so they were very complex. So you wouldn't never underestimate the power of childhood and how much, a human brain is impacted at that point whenever, it's exposed to. And it's probably the largest field of investment could ever be found, right, from a strictly economical point of view. And but this phrase mostly made me try, but a respect, and also an interest and a general appreciation towards history, which was already some of my favorite interests indeed, and subjects, etc. And I bought the idea that after all, history, what happens in the past is, if not directly a guidance, but still something you can look at to say, oh, look how many, what can humans do, right? Especially single individuals can do, right? Because that's the simplest thing to realize. Then the more I went on, and the more, when you're in, you're teenage and you start getting kind of more aggressive, more political, more violent, and you start siding factionally, right? And so everything historical, I remember since middle school and high school, because primary school was the heaven, right, where everybody was happy in a sense. Then middle school, high school, things get kind of rougher, and history at that point was, let's say, I was probably, even in there, one of the few people who was actually interested in history in general, and more also because I knew a bit more and I liked to learn further, and I did well in that subject. It was extremely easy for me. But I noticed that there was something bothering me about that phrase, because it's as if the ignorance of the average ignorance of people would bring to say essentially to have I can say nor at the same time both an idolatric and iconoclastic attitude towards still the great figures of history. That is to say, that substantiated itself, let's say better, in the idea that you can't look at history for solving your own problems, right? And those phrases that I hated about history included also the idea is that the only reason why history is worth being learned is fundamentally to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, right? So, which is something that I still have an enormous contention with as an idea, because I fundamentally believe it's wrong, or at least if it is. If it has some element of of consistency, it shouldn't bring to make you think that just looking at history fundamentally is enough for you to spot replicas in the present, that you can, because most of the time it was political, was blaming them, right? Most of the things I've heard like in this time was if you look at it was all about fascism. Let's be honest, because I'm the chunk of Europe where we had fascism as opposed to communism, and the greater deal is, vote looking at history first of all, if to search for models in general. So that kind of heroic virtuous element was kind of cut down in a way. And secondly, it's as if all the significance of history got down to recognize fascism, or what you think fascism was, because also don't think that Westerners have an idea of what fascism or communism concretely were, especially in these times. But you would be surprised to know how far this was true even in those times, when they actually were, and recognize the fascists today, right? So essentially make a paste and copy of what fascism was supposed to be, or already misinterpreted still in a way that wasn't right, democratic at all, right, or kind of even intelligent for that matter, but still not in a sense that it was an ultra civic or democratic motivation behind it. It was more like witch hunting, right? Find was going to be the next fascist, so that every politician that would be mildly, right wing, or as opposed to immigration, or at least the legal one, and all this stuff would simply say, defend property rights or capitalism and so forth. That's fascist, right? And I think many of you relate to this, meaning that we have seen this all, and we're still seeing it in many ways. It's just that at this point, historical understanding or references of the past have simply gone beyond, meaning that the next generations don't even know history anymore, meaning that I think our generation kind of understood at least what history was for different reasons. Today, I don't think there is really a projection towards that. I think we're becoming like a civilization without past, and hence, basically dying out from any kind of point of view. And what sickened me at that point was kind of the determinism of it, right? Is pretending that in order, let's assume that history was useful to spot such kind of coming backs, right? Like the one that you can argue is possible, right? If we didn't know what fascism was, it would be we wouldn't know what, let's say, what we wouldn't be able to recognize fascism, at least in considering what happened historically because of it in the past. But first of all, we're living in reality, so this is not going to happen unless you don't erase history, which sounds something suspiciously fascist and communist given the past experience. And so at that point, that would be the last of your problems, because they would have already taken over. And in fact, I would like to make you reflect on this. But secondly, if you were actually interested in history and legitimately concerned about the possibility of some, political upheavals with anti-democratic, consequences, all these stuff, assuming that would be even the worst of all problems in the meanwhile, which unfortunately is not even just the case, as history proves. And we're very lucky to live in the time we do. How can you be so grotesquely ignorant, oblivious, and superficial to realize that history never repeats itself, not even a single time, because it's mathematically impossible from a purely, from purely physical point of view. And therefore, if you really care about this thing so much, the first thing you should do would always be not to pretend to spot things that you don't even understand, that you enucleate as, hypostatic, dogmatic concepts according to your own very personal definition, because there is not even a person that agrees on the same things historically as for anybody else, for that matter. And if, therefore, brutally, violently, and radically underestimating the present. So what is going effectively to happen in a reality that is different from the one that generated in the past some bad stuff that did happen, that is dangerous, that can't come back in the form, for example, of doctrine, or of this kind of orientation. There is some polarization. There are patterns, right? and history is interpreted through patterns and narratives, etc. But how these are declined in reality is as a completely different matter, right? And it's already difficult by itself to properly even fix the boundaries of such dichotomies in the way they take place, because we are usually we are biologically programmed to reason in terms of dichotomies, but again, the way this takes form in reality is hardly anything so strictly categorical, and it changes continuously, or even when we don't see, in fact, maybe the pattern continues, but at levels that get past so many others that are changing in the meanwhile, and that all cause different things. And also by following Schwerpunkt, that my interpretation of history is, of course, the one of let's say not the interpretation of history in itself, but just as a function, let's say better, the one of providing you with some kind of universal understanding, right? Which doesn't mean that the world is homogeneous at all, but this is exactly the point. It may seem paradoxical to some, but because they're not habituated normally to reason in terms of comprehensive understanding. There is properly a scientific reasoning within a system that has some some boundaries and some, approximately at least, and then that therefore can be analyzed from top to bottom in a way that at least you don't miss in perspective the scalar importance of what really makes the difference in the whole system overall. But I give you, it's not easy to understand, but when you're exposed to a lot of history, you tend to see that that wall, and so what are, at least on the surface, the mechanisms that happened when eventually, if you descend into details, of course, it gets very complicated, but you're also talking about ever less important things. So that's yet another reason why there can't be moral relativism, for that matter, unless there is no historical understanding and a scientific one, fundamentally, right? And that's also the brutal aspect of the today's properly moral, scientific, and historical illiteracy. This idea of considering things like science or morality or history itself as separated things, as things that are sort of meta-structural, that you have just to pursue for the sake of themselves without kind of connection with the wall. That's extremely disturbing. That's exactly the condition of moral misery that brought people to accept, to let happen, or to actually support things like the Holocaust, or the Stalinian purges, or the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution in China. I mean, and so there is something that we understand here from history, of course, that humans can be fooled that easily, right? There is hardly, you see, a person that cannot understand it's not about the evil, right? There can be a huge debate here between what good and evil. That I don't use these terms I use mostly right or wrong, because I do believe that, after all, what we call as good and evil derive from being right or wrong about a scientific understanding of the world. So a person who automatically is either a fascist or a communist, by definition, is a radically underdeveloped individual. As the capability of siding with it automatically declares the complete historical ignorance of the world. That is exactly what we're failing at, because let's be honest, educational systems do not provide us anymore with that, with the comprehensive, with the scale. So that's why easy to manipulate people. And why we have so many moral illiterates at this point, right? In other times in history, it wasn't really like that, right? The world was not, let's say, less moral because there was more abuse or oppression or sufferance. It was more moral because people were directly exposed to the mechanisms of the world, because the world was somewhat simpler as a system, physically speaking. So direct action was much more evenly connected with the consequences that were evident by some degree. Now we are maturing this problem that we have experienced chiefly with mass society, that in fact produced that initial disorientation. You can argue that mass societies, human communities tend to fix problems, right? I don't think that that humanity is doomed. If not, of course, in a physical sense, it has to end at some point, and it will, right? It's just let's say it's important to have faith in humanity, at least potentially speaking, right? We have seen what we're able to do, but let's say the fact that we're still here after the 20th century, after the world wars, after the Cold War, well, fundamentally, yeah, we may be absolutely lucky. We could have already, have disappeared by this time. But the fact that things went the way they did, it's not mere coincidence. It's not just rolling the dice. I mean, of course, in a sense it is, but there is also a teleological element without which there would have not been an order, a control, an intelligence to regulate the system, so that would avoid wiping each other out of the face of the earth, which could still easily happen, telling the truth. So what I didn't like at all of this, say, almost consumeristic idea of history is like, spot the analogies and, just label stuff, right? That is one of the most anti-scientific concepts that you can ever do, and especially with history that is literally the history of everything. This is the magic of history that I think it's dramatically overlooked, that there is no other. It's not about the subject in itself, the subject of inquiry, that is, or maybe it's exactly because of that, right? It's not, but I mean, it's not like other subjects. You can say, well, they're just covering different aspects, sectorially speaking. History really doesn't, right? Of course, there are ways we make history, like, that have a certain face, if you want. History is very similar to sociology in a certain sense, and I horrify myself as a historian just to say that, but I mean tendentially, like as a general spectrum of of inquiry, we don't study like the most insignificant details that really we can't even just for assessment. There are things like this because in fact history is huge, but this is exactly the point. It covers the entire human existence and experience, because it can be literally about everything, right? And we discovered, and one reason why we decided to make it something more significant by scale is of course that bigger events are more important, and so that's kind of obvious, but also because in fact I think civilizationally speaking, in spite of what we are turning like from a merely academic point of view, in terms of hyper-specialization and lack of that kind of comprehensive understanding, we have understood, of course, that in order to bear positive fruits, history has to prevalently cope with, I mean, at least to bring the most positive fruits, it has to cover big systems, right? Because it could be, again, literally about everything, and there are some historians that really deal with topics that you would think, but how meaningful are these? Like, who is ever going back? Who is going to improve significantly the world, even from a in a small sense by reading the stuff, right? It can you may be amazed by how important details are indeed, but you also have to be honest about this. Like, just speaking from a military historical point of view, it's obvious that you cannot understand military history and the art of war specifically if you don't study kind of most of warfare in general, right? And there is an obvious reason why this happens. That it's not inherent to the art of war in itself or military history, but it's obviously getting in more data and being able to make sense of the world more comprehensively, so that, yeah, maybe the details, you'll have to refine, but still it's important to get the essentials, the fundamentals right first. So I didn't like at all initially the idea of Historia Magistra Vitae, as long as it was just some sort of again, in fact, mere, let's think that we can positively find a teaching from, not from history, but from stories, right? There can be something to that too, because every story has a history, as we were saying before, as well. So it's always meaningful. But there is something way more comprehensive than the stories we're told, mostly in our, in our youth, in our childhood, in our adolescence, as if, there are the big, bearded, professors that tell you the deep sap of, historical. But most of the times, not even professors really care about a comprehensive reading of history, and what the broader magisterium in this sense of history should really mean. And so here Cicero was hitting, the right chords actually of that that meaning. I reevaluated the meaning of the phrase when I managed to get past that disorientation initially. When you start studying history, you're obviously going to pinpoint some kind of examples that you can orientate yourself in, and so becoming almost mythomaniacal about that. Right, this is like those people who come to harass you because you use the term Byzantine as opposed to Roman, because they think somehow that is really a historically relevant thing, and they're convinced by that because, again, they don't have a comprehensive understanding why the term is used, or even if they think they have already fanatically assumed that it's just a concept that is wrong. It's that there is no substance to what you can argumentate about that, and it happens all the time, and that's you can spot immediately that that's a person at the first, at the latest, the second year of university that can come up with that kind of fanatism, or some kind of, because it's an emotionalistic take, right? Because before 24, 25 years old, you're still, your prefrontal cortex is not yet fully developed, so you have you're like more, in terms even of memory, more like a sponge, so you get all things in because you're still emotionally, you can still be impressed emotionally by lots of things, so that are going to remain stuck in your head, and therefore you need the symbols and emotions to start putting, like, the foundations of your historical knowledge. But and eventually you must start building something over this foundation, and that's where things start becoming really, really interesting, right? So the phrase, as we were saying, goes like Historia, vero, testis, temporum. So this is a beautiful way of putting it, because it says properly history is vero. So here the veritas in Latin is, just as you understand from the different etymology in English, different from truth, right? It's something closer to, in fact, in English itself, there is the term veridicity, right? That doesn't have, that is slightly different semantically to veritas. Of course, it doesn't, veritas is more totalizing, right? Latin, as most ancient languages, was much more, archaic, simple, but yet more ultra semantically loaded, so with meanings that, in fact, we don't have words today to properly translate equally. At some point we could make some of these broader translations, because it really means much. And so vero here stands for something that is truthful to the person, right? Something you can't be really fooled by, because it's the sincerity of it that makes it valid in itself, right? So history is truthfully the witness of times, and the fact that it is truthfully, it's and here Cicero is stressing the fact that you cannot fool around with history. This is a concept I've been reflecting on recently because, again, of that conspiratorial attitude that we mostly clothe ourselves with when it comes to history, that is, there is some shady evil force behind that makes, the ignorant, the superstitious believe that history went in a certain way, but it went in another way because there were some pure martyrs and saints and lambs that, were stolen of the real memory, the real past. These things, history is built also like that, but history goes far beyond that, meaning that the reality of things that happen, we see it by approximation, by knowing history, is really the reality of what happened, right? Of course, if we were to look at, if we had a magic power, say, to highlight, let's say, the degree of veridicity of history, that is to say, in percentage, how much of this story that we have written is true. Of course, nobody can do that because the truth, as we always say now at this point, exists, and we can get closer to it, but we cannot fully grasp it. But we would probably see that, there are some swings. You would expect actually more recent history to be more accurate. Actually, it's not like that. It takes a lot of time before, the events that just passed can be properly interpreted, and written and explained in a coherent, systematic fashion. This is especially true of our times and of the 20th century so far, because, let's say, I presume up to the 19th, right, it was possible to make a history of the century. In the 20th, I think it's impossible, right? I think we started having so many sources that you can't practically have a comprehensive, dominating understanding of it all, right? There is surely, it can be done. Of course, you can study history of the 20th century and you can have a good understanding of it, but let's say a comprehensive sense of at some levels of depth that can be disconcertingly, large by scale is still an extremely remote possibility, right? And simply there is too much to know, and also events that occurred are somewhat too fresh in our, for our bias to accept them in a way or another. So we do this always in the same time. This, of course, happens also for the other centuries, the other eras. But overall, so we would see that probably we got, the 19th century right, the 18th century even better, 16th, but then probably there is a regression at a certain point towards the High Middle Ages, and then, it goes ups and downs, this kind of veridicity of history. But overall, and this is something that, believe me, until you're not exposed to large historical data, it's not easy to convince people about. What we see, given that we keep discovering things and we keep analyzing things and we put our evidence under an incredible crossfire, say, of proper criticism, the various interpretations are all reviewed. There is a ferocious competition also among historians, etc. That often maybe it's not aimed, in fact, at finding out exactly what happened. It's more, especially now, about producing stuff, publishing stuff. But we see and we agree, because it seems that as humans we can objectively arrive to the same conclusion from different roads, and at that point it means something, that what we think that happened, that fully we will never know, because you don't fully what happened to you, not even today. Let's be honest about that. But it does fit with the evidence that we are provided with, meaning that it's the evidence that shows, let's say, a reality that you cannot quite eliminate. Yes, it's still subject to interpretation, but you can't really make much relativism around the fact, I don't know, that that the Parthenon exists, right? And what that means, given all the enormous set of evidence that we have together with that. I say this because there are people who, even intelligent ones, that, historians, or maybe, okay, not historians, but, somebody passionate in history that came to me sometimes and told me about what do we know whether history is real? Like, where we know that the ancient history, it's not much just as we say, but it even existed in the first place. And of course, I smile because of the naivety of this whole thing, right? Sometimes and that is revealing, of course, but of how much we don't teach what history is properly. For what we know, for an average historian, at least, with the right level of education, which again, don't ever give for granted that this thing is always going to be at that level, because it's already sunk in the last generation. So it can lead to very disturbing places, especially when it's leaving room for political activism rather than, and history is always political, right? But one thing is, trying to convince a balanced audience. Another thing is just fueling, breathing on fire to make it bigger, right? And so that's yet another thing. And we all do that, right? But still, we have to confrontate with somebody else out there. So the fact-checking system that we have today, at least, I don't know, in the environment where I form myself, I think is good, right? And it is good because it's self-recognizable. That is to say, humans understand that given a set of information about the various institutions, that there is one place that works better than another. It's easy to understand. Even when you don't actually see the thing, you can immediately grasp whether there is substance to some form of education and training and method and inquiry than another that is doing, simply because it's doing something else, because it doesn't even care to show you, even a glimpse of objectivity. So, the result is that, history is actually does tell us that the more we do it, the more it tells us that, what we get from the past is kind of right? There is no major diversion. Of course, if you go back very far back in time, especially in prehistory, but also the early history and so on, it's easier to miss important pieces, right? But let's say in more modern times, it's really a bit difficult, right? And especially, in fact, sometimes we think history is mostly, and this maybe is connected with the prejudice of this Historia Magistra Vitae common interpretation, that's maybe just a voice or something like an opinion or something said simply that tells us what history is or is not. But history is actually, I am a perfect supporter of the superiority of documentary sources, basically over everything. Right, I'm a historian. What can you do? We're not archaeologists, even though we should be the same persons. But even just in fact to actually stress the importance of these other branches. You cannot really fool yourself. Thinking that the ancient world did not exist. First of all, because of the overwhelming amount of archaeological evidence, like something, that you cannot that overlaps in a way that cannot be fabricated. That's the interesting thing, right? If somebody thinks that is possible, has never studied history, like has never read a history article or how it works and how we put things together, how we expose it to the rest of the world, it was kind of conspiracy fabrication. It would have immediately, even with assuming that the means we have now, came from a background where such fabrication would have convinced people that this was the case. With the means that we have now, we would immediately discover it, right? And historians have been doing it for a very long time, because there were historical fakes, right? And that were fakes not because of actually tricking people who would come later, because they wouldn't even know how to cope with them. Let's be honest, right? You cannot predict the future, and consequently, you can't even know you can fool people who come later. But because it was a contingency, right? It's like the false donation of Constantine. Well, it was created in 8th century, 9th century France or Italy, it was created for that context. It was not created for, when Valla in the 15th century, that was also, by the way, a papal guy fundamentally. So you have to appreciate the honesty and the fact that it was acknowledged at the time, and it was of course a modern open-mindedness compared to what people usually believe, that fundamentally such forces in the history were that to discover that it was evidently false. But even just think about, what do we know that Aristotle actually exists? Well, don't you think that linguistically speaking, we can actually spot with our philological capacities, or that, there is a language that you cannot fabricate to make it fit with all the other fragments, epigraphically, documentally, whatever, that we will find eventually later, that tells us that, of course, in ancient Greece, they wrote in some way that, was not the one that you could find in the Middle Ages, right? Was it a fabrication? How naive can you be, and how, in fact, unexposed to the comprehensive dimension of the world you can be to believe such a thing, right? And this is valid for all conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories essentially are successful because they unburden people from the weight of reality, just eventually to be completely destroyed by it, because that's what history also has taught us, that people who deny reality fail, right? And that's why, again, fascism and communism, as we were saying before, could not but fail, right? Even if they had succeeded for longer time, right? There was no way to limit human thought, right, to something so ridiculous in the first place from a merely cultural point of view, right? But we're talking about a very low level of mental development, and without which it would have not been possible, right? How could you rule the Soviet Union if it had not been the land of the fourth state? Right, that would have not been possible to do anywhere else, right? And that's also the reason why it collapsed in the end, because not just because of the Russians, but because of all the other peoples that, in conditions of of oppression and tyranny, etc., began to simply shake off the Soviet yoke, and all the disgusting abomination of the dignity of humanity that communism, in the deepest roots of its non-intelligent, represents. But this is too much for many people to understand, because, again, if you're not exposed to that, if you don't climb up on that level of understanding, you will never see it. This is the main problem we have now, that we don't make people climb anymore, and that's a way of controlling them, of course, right? Flattering them in the delusion that just because they have an opinion, this opinion has any meaning or value whatsoever in front of reality. And this is an autoimmune disease. It's actually a psychological problem. It's, essentially paranoia. And we know, in fact, that these mental illnesses were dramatically present in countries that experienced such misfortunes, let's call it in this way. So, I agree with Cicero. History is really the true witness of times, right? It's at least the best we have. And it turns out that the way we civilizationally are able to, find things out works, right? Is coherent with that. It does fit when we understand what we discover of new that happened. And this is interesting because you see also in, in Nazi Germany, in fascist Italy, in Soviet Russia, there were some big artistic, archaeological, historical achievements among the others, because of course you cannot have any kind of organized community that doesn't have a glimpse of civilization, of statal dimension, of interest, of research, and so on. So this of course means that even the most moral objection can't not work, first of all, without a level of intelligence, reality, because otherwise it would simply collapse. And that, of course, even those who are trying kind of to fake history in a sense, still cannot depart from what history has been, right? Like, imagine that you're, a Nazi or a Bolshevik, and you have to enforce those ideologies on the world, on a world that, okay, very different backgrounds, but say on a world that has lived for millennia with some understanding of the world, that has, there's not just an opinion in somebody's mind, but it's literally how that culture has been informed and has built literally the world as we see it. You cannot erase the memory of something like of a past. Some can by a certain degree, but it's also how bad you can exploit that kind of misery. I mean, look at China today. China today has erased history, but what they did, they destroyed all the temples they had. They rebuilt them. This all unbeknownst of, or at least, while we could not watch. And so, because they realized that in order to stress the Han nationalism and all these things, those symbols were kind of needed in a sense. They had to be of some use civilizationally, because there can't be like a civilization without a historical tradition and memory and past proper. And but it was obvious that it was very easy for 20th century communists to make of China the thing that it became, because of the appalling moral and material misery of the country, which is exactly what the same reason for Russia, for think about the depression of Europe after World War the First, the Weimar Republic, and the Italian when the fascists took power and so on, and this in fact was a problem. It was not just a problem of these countries; it was a problem pretty much everywhere, and that's where also you're told that the result it's just a matter of degrees, right? You have always to understand what is what's that degree of instability that is not much whether it's, again, fascism or communism, left or right, but whether it speaks the language of civilization, whether it's something rational, scientific based, and therefore whether provided with of an elevated, developed, comprehensive moral system that must know what history is and how it happened. I'd say history is just beautiful to learn, I would say. It's something that never ends. It's like cherries. You eat one, you want to finish the whole bunch, and it's it because what you get from that is exponential. This is valid for all knowledge, but history is so shaded and different, etc., that it's always provoking you in a way that hardly any other subject can, because it never ends, sadly. Or better, for better or for worse, because we all know we will never be able to dominate even a minimal part of it. But paradoxically, as humans, we can understand, generally speaking, what it is. So do not confuse the amount of evidence with the capacity to understand the world, generally speaking, because human brain has a synthesis capacity that no computer has, right? That we have that superpower, and that's the reason why we can also understand bigger systems more or less, even if we are actually not exposed to the entirety of the evidence, which would be uncomputable by our brain capacity still. And that a machine would have, in this sense, just because it's programmed by humans, no idea of what to do with in the first place. And that's why, fortunately enough, in terms of employment, in spite of all the misery in a sense, historians will never disappear, and that's an advantage. Think about it. So yes, I agree with the first. Then history is, so this is all the list. Lux veritatis, right? And here Cicero stresses properly the enlightening nature of history, literally the light of the truth. And so of something that cannot, and this tells you the confidence that he had in history, by the way, and already at the time was understood as the, in the moment of the great expansion of Roman power and its, world dominating, as in spite of the, of the internal political strifes that Cicero's life beautifully exemplified, and that wrote, because it's the strife that brings this itself to have such concepts about history, right? The light of the truth, which is a definition you may agree or not agree, I guess, but it's it's more than just a witness. You see, it's properly here. It gets to a level of neurocognitive capacity of enlightening on the past, right? Because the witness of the times, of the temporum, right? So, understanding that there are different times also, right? The witness of the different times that have passed, and that we have to understand as literally as different people will live through. I mean, we are lucky enough at this point in our history to already be seeing, for example, many videos from even more than 100 years ago, so that we can see literally the same people that we are in a different time, right? So exposed to different conditions, for us to understand how much that can change us, but still realizing that we're kind of still the same, right? And surely from a biological point of view, independently from minor changes that do happen for some reasons that are even not, in fact, that positive in general, but can be virtually irrelevant, at least in our run, then Cicero says that history is vita memoriae. So stressing properly a biological continuity of history. This is also interesting because you can imagine in Roman times even how history was made, right? And it's not very differently from today in the measure in which we, there are not just historiographers, right? There are also, traditions, voices, sayings, or all these things that are part of that. So the life of memory, Cicero puts it, is it's properly the idea that history feeds memory to keep it alive, and to keep alive memory, right? So this is a very spot-on scientific recognition of the fact that everything we learn fundamentally is history, right? That there is properly a narrative that we have to follow like a trail in order to keep our memory and consequently our understanding alive, exercised, fit. That's why there can't be properly an intelligence without history. Cicero is the same one who wrote that, who doesn't know history is destined to remain a child forever. That's absolutely true. As far as I'm concerned, age has hardly to do with biology, especially the more you go on, right? And the more you develop yourself intellectually, let's say, unless something, at some point degeneration, aging brings to the unavoidable end. But let's say there is a huge moral difference in scale between somebody that just leaves without caring about anything that happens, somebody that learns continuously about what happens. And I don't think it takes to explain why, right? Again, if you are navigating yourself in the perils of life and so on, you're going to have a much better chance of success. The more you know, the more you can picture your position in the storm, to know where you have to go and what kind of meaning that has for you. And so that simply makes you more successful, and therefore makes you reach more, and will simply make you lead at some point, whereas others will simply lag behind and will passively live their lives in that sense. And believe me, this aspect is and this Vita Memoriae is connected, in fact, so much to the next one that is properly Magistra Vita that that makes you realize how history changes the quality of a person. I wanted to make many videos on this. That is to say, how can history help you in life? I think I made something recently or this year, well, because of my elaborations about the difficulties of maintaining a morale properly, but without morals you can't really do that, and that's why also they are basically the same thing, really. And how history can help, like what can, in this sense, history provide us with, and hence the idea of history as teacher of life, which is a hard topic, because as we've just stated, it's not say, if you think that history is just teacher of life, you're going to assume in this kind of didactic sense that there is some preconceived notion of what you should learn from history, and that's the negative way that is also the most prevalent, that I hate it, in fact, in order to interpret the phrase, because it destroys any active responsibility in making history, which is exactly the point. I mean, of course, history must be learned as such, and there is, in fact, a didactic element. It may seem theoretical as well, and theories are built. So, first of all, you should create your own theory. That's the point that the history is calling you for. Like it's the idea. Look at all the stuff there is in here. Try to make sense of it, and it's you who has to make sense of it. And when there is instead a prevalent idea that history is just something sculpted forever somewhere, that you can't really change it. You just have already acquired, let's say, or you can acquire without making any kind of effort of interpretation or understanding how it works and so on. You don't make even the effort of learning it anymore, right? That may be one of the reasons why we don't even bring people to learn history practically anymore, because we don't offer them even the thrill of being able to create, to start making history by themselves. We just tell them, just as and this is valid for every scientific field, right? It's not just because there are historians or doctors or physicists or whatever, that whoever these people are, they're just competent by themselves, or they always have the answer. We cannot responsibilize people through the creation of cases, fundamentally, that detain, almost priestly-like, sacerdotal-like, this truth that they already know, that they are the only one that can shed, and actually manipulating people. I'll tell you that there are even certain prominent historical figures nowadays that tell history in a shameful way, right? Because you can appreciate, of course, the perspective in terms of just because of its diversity, but we don't appreciate just that things also have to make sense, and especially when we have already passed, let's say, through some interpretations that we have tested, and we know how simplistic they are, and how kind of irrelevant in that sense that they are to the actual historical debate. Bringing them on the fore just because there is an audience of people who do not even know that such things happen behind the scenes. It's a form of dishonesty, if not of criminality per se, because especially when these people are followed by millions, and they think they become some kind of mediums between the past and the people, right? And so they start becoming somewhat they operate this sense of, okay, I will think about it, you don't think about history, just take it from me, and That's all what you need to do, right? It's not like that. You know that on Schwerpunkt I try to challenge you, that things I say are provocative, but I never try to sell you a narrative for which I say, there is no other narrative for it. Of course, I don't express all the possible narratives that exist, but, about my own, I always try to tell you, like I'm doing today. It's a self-analysis. It's like, does this thing stand on its feet, and why? And why I think it is the case. If you start thinking that history instead is just, something given to you, that you don't have to even, have any kind of interpretation of course it should be a valid interpretation as well, but that you think that's not even important conceptually. What is important conceptually is how you see the information you've been given on the basis of the source that you've been given. Because people are sources themselves. And so the question is, how much authority do you attribute to that? And I'm discontent about this, because I have arrived to the point I can boast years of expertise in my field, right? And so when I was younger, I could just see, you're against that opinion, but that professor is, a scholar, has years and years of experience, so you cannot come there and say, this is wrong. As a matter of fact, you can, right? You should be able to, which is what most people, of course, that disagree in general with anything that everybody says, most of the times do not really, say anything meaningful whatsoever, in fact. And that's also, however, how they can be fooled into thinking that scholar, just because he's a scholar, has that kind of authoritativeness that cannot be challenged. And if we ever have arrived at this point, we're arrived at a very risky and problematic point in our cultural history. Surely in the West as we've known it, right? This may be really the beginning of a crude decline. Because, in part that this has already started, but, the way it's taking shape, it's really disturbing as well. And it gets crazy at so many levels, because you find people that are even ultra specialized in certain fields, as you know, but that have lost completely the plot of the whole picture, for which we arrive also to the point of saying, we should just take what people are, we should just rely on the people who, of course, are more expert on a specific field, because they are the only ones that they're kind of reliable on that. But as soon as these people talk about anything else, they suck and they say very stupid things. Well, this is kind of obvious, right? It's obvious that I can't teach you chemistry, which I even liked when I studied, but I couldn't. You start seeing, the more you progress in a certain field, how desperately ignorant you are about anything else. It's normal, right? Axiomatically speaking. But this was not. This also has to do with the forms of education, because up to some generation ago, really the experts were experts about not everything, but about much, but vastly more than what we are today, right? And not because, let's say, more information has been now, put on the fore, which is another issue by historiography about the single topic, so that there is more to know and we can know everything. Now, I'm talking properly about still the absolute amount of knowledge, which is lower today, as owned by a single individual in those academic, those academic levels, and also the relative, the qualitative one. And again, the reason being that that magisterium that derives from history as a whole, so that superiority that history provides you with, is not searched for anymore, right? So the term Magistra Vita, in this sense, it's a totalizing and beautiful and imposing and scary phrase, because it shows you that, you see, Magistra here is mistress, in a sense, properly master, and which comes from maius. Think about the mos maiorum that the same Cicero, claimed to be necessary, and it was literally the mos is as the same etymology of mos moris plural moris. It's properly the morals, right? So it was the morals of the maiorum that are nonetheless then the great ones, right? So essentially, in this case, what in Roman society, in the Roman world, had been the leaders, the great ones that had made Rome in virtue of their moral superiority. So, if this is the same, in fact, etymology of history here, we're not talking about history just as a teacher. We're talking about history as literally the master of life. The master meaning an active ruler, not a somebody that you can't just I want to consult history just for. No, it means that history weighs on everything, on every person's life, on the entire community, politically, socially, even militarily. You cannot ignore that and simply saying, well, I can't live in a world without knowing history. Again, Cicero says you're basically like a child, and a child here means a lot, because what meant in the Roman world is not what means today, right? Today we see children as just, yes, we still have this idea of, parental responsibility, more or less, and the fact that children are somewhat, in fact, undeveloped humans in that regard, but we don't like to stress that aspect anymore. We think of children just as sort of young adults that have to kind of fit and conform, right? And we stress just childhood per se as just one of the stages of life, nothing else. What childhood means in that sense is literally the idea that, if you don't know history, you're a child in measure in which you have essentially no faculty, no developed intelligence, no possibility of venturing yourself in the world and making anything licit, because at that age you simply can't. You need a tutor, you need a parent or whoever works for them, and so this is and a radical view that, however, is very consistent with what the success of an individual in politics and society has to do with the understanding of the same, and unavoidably of history as such. Is there a discrepancy between this? I mean, are just successful people just that capable historically? Well, evidently it's not true. I mean, of course, people generally speaking, that arrive to command and such things, generally speaking, know more than others, right? That's on average true, because they wouldn't make it true anyway, right? Unless they were, at least the more complex the society is, the kind of the truer that this tends to be. But this doesn't mean that they necessarily, because they have practice from their side, and one of the faults of the way we make history today is that we don't recognize, in fact, the importance of history applied, right? That is to say, of experience, rather than just theory. So that is part of the explanation of why there is this discrepancy. But at the same time, it is kind of true that the historian is a scientist and dominates this realm of humanity better than basically any other possible subject, because again, every other subject essentially speaks from a dimension that is maybe totalizing in a certain dimension, but it's not omnicomprehensive like history. So that's why we make jokes that the idea is that the historian is the one that takes everything, all the possible knowledge from reality, and makes it and describes and explains reality, which is probably the greatest task and the most difficult one. In fact, we don't make miracles in that regard, but it's the only one that can provide with the actual explanation of the world we live in, more than any other abstract data. And of course, we haven't created super scientists, and it couldn't be just historians at that point. But it couldn't be people who just speculate either, right? I have had, for example, a dramatic, let's say, approach to philosophy, which I loved. For example, when I was in high school, I studied for years, and as history of philosophy, which was dramatically useful. And yet, when I went to, I took a couple of classes of philosophy at university, and then I met the human types that were there. I'm sure there are philosophers among you. I was, let's say, very surprised by I should have not been, by the obvious detachment, the difference, that the gap that existed between, say, the historical, practicality and the philosophical abstraction. It wasn't much because, what I learned there wasn't interesting or wasn't useful, but I noticed that it was useful as long as it was connected essentially to anything real or concrete, whereas the people who were there didn't seem to be interested in anything really concrete, for that matter. They were more in love with the concept, with the idea, and not with the actual applicability, right? That's where they're very ideologized. In fact, even more politicized faculties than my actually it's the same faculty, but let's say departments, whatever you call them. Whereas with history, this is something that I discovered along the way. I think we are much less ideological, basically, than any other branch that we've ever seen. And the reason why this seemed to happen to me is that while historians try to make sense of the world picture, politically, militarily, military, not really more than much, I can tell you from my perspective, at least I do, and socially, but however, still politically and socially, brings you to some insights that, again, make you kind of much more objective. You can't say realistic, because also realism is not quite the answer, as we study historically, of course. But objective in what is real, in fact, what is pertaining to reality, not what is pertaining to an idea. It can be seducing, prerogative, whatever. But if it doesn't meet with a confirmation in reality, what is its use, right? Yes, it can be an exercise. It can help you to understand certain concepts. We'll talk about philosophy in this sense, but it's not just about philosophy. It's about, to me, radically ideologized people that I've found were people from archaeology, from philology, from even history of literature in general. People that took, even simply as maybe they were very good, of course, in their own respective fields, but took a much more, especially politically, right, radical direction than basically any historian that so far I've met that I consider as a good historian. In fact, what is fascinating to me is that in certain circumstances, for example, yesterday we were finishing Dante's series. That was interesting to me because I took the chance to reapproach the character and so on. And, this idea of Ghibellinism, for example, the idea of the empire, right, of the universality of values, this seems to come from individuals that have covered more historically than others. This is properly they have more kind of a almost encyclopedically oriented interest, right? Think about the number of videos they made here, like properly the idea of managing to have a comprehensive view pops out when you start approaching these topics at large, right? I was just talking last week with a colleague of mine at dinner that we've seen each other after these years that I wouldn't go at university even when it was reopened, etc. We studied different things. It was still about the later Middle Ages, and we found that we already knew that, let's say, but we found ourselves as dramatically agreeing with the imperial ideology in the Middle Ages in how it developed and what it meant and what even in there was concretely applied like. because that's where we drew it from. It wasn't a theoretical speculation. It was literally what we had found out from the sources, that in our respective cases were distanced, but were many, and were, from so many different authors, and of all the possible, you would see, if the outcome was random, we would have had different ideas. Point. Instead, we came essentially to the same one. So that's not really not seeing a pattern. That's seeing a meaning, right? You cannot, as we were saying at the beginning, you cannot really replicate patterns historically and thinking that they all fit in without any kind of okay, that's just how it happened in the past, right? I also make comparisons of that kind, right? I always say that we are in mid-14th century and all this stuff. That's more a provocation. I would never say that in a serious publishing, right? But even if I could even address the thing, but it would be like an introductory idea, or a great provocation, but it's still also a primitive thought, right? And you will forgive me for the fact of dispensing it on Schwerpunkt, and I don't think less of you in that sense, but I care also about, generally speaking, in that sense, I would be writing to people that in general maybe are already beyond the concept, obviously recognize that you can't quite make that equation, but here it's maybe a gross or concept, but it's important to be told, especially if never maybe pictured what the 14th century was, and maybe even concretely what we are in now. So to me, history has that kind of balancing function, simply because it's unavoidably scientific in nature, and it challenges you constantly to find a solution, to an explanation for something real, not for something that you dream of. And not because historians do not have dreams, but we would like to see them fulfilled exactly on the basis of how do we explain reality so that we can operate in it in a more functional way. And I presume that there is a lot of beneficial help that derives from learning history for really everybody. And I do sense that you feel it yourself. You do understand that history has that capacity, because otherwise you wouldn't be interested in it. That's the first reason why you want to know about that. I mean, there are many reasons why people, of course, want to learn history, and they're not the best ones. But it turns out, again, that the more they learn history, and kind of those ideas tend to improve. Why? Because they become more real. They're not delusional, right? And this is because you're habituated to sort out an enormity of factors that it turns out we can do with all the limits, of course, of this of this operation, but that still, in that sense, are habituate you to be less relativistic about the bigger things. And this stands at the base of our system of education. We first lay the basis, but the bases have to be right? So the bases have to be the most important things. Like we teach, medieval history. You start learning the simpler things, and then you descend into the lower ones, or say in the smaller ones. This path should also be reinforced properly as a method, right? There should be a sort of certification in that sense. Instead, what usually happens today, you study badly a medieval history manual, and then you simply pass to, the hyper, detailed stuff, and all what lays in between in terms of even understanding a bit better the major political and institutional dynamics of the world, let alone the military one, is completely skipped. And you already get into a mode would be, aimed at, fixating that kind of field of research and not looking left or right and knowing nothing, or not even much ahead or backwards, to make a living with history, which is unsurprisingly in that sense not a very advantageous choice, but not quite too much. But there is also, honestly, I can tell you, recently I've been disgusted with exhibitionism, with those professors that go spend their entire life on Instagram posting memes about history, just about, medieval history, Lords of the Rings, and all this bullshit. Like, what kind of realist? I mean, we're losing the standards. You see, I make these videos here because I objectively say something that if you search around, you never find, right? And I don't do it because I'm a mythomaniacal exhibitionist. I do it because I like I like explaining the things. Memes are just for imbeciles, and let's be honest. Like, if you want, there is one that is particularly funny, it can be, but you can't spend your entire life, sponsoring history in that sense, in a medievalist sense. This happens also among my colleagues, right? Just because we are medievalists, you have to post all the time bullshit memes about what's the sense of that? Have we gotten to that? Like, can't you do anything better? Okay, say, but maybe it's just a pastime. Maybe they work hard afterward, do they? Because you see, you can talk to them, and yes, they do work hard, but how much you would be surprised by how the results sometimes are in fact that narrow, and therefore what they present themselves like to the world cannot be about their field of expertise, because nobody kind of cares about that, and so they have to stress out that maybe they're frustrated enough to stress that they're the club of the medievalists who have this great knowledge of medieval history. Really not, let me tell you, because even at the manualistic level you could check them, and excellent historians for anything else, but again, where's the comprehensive dimension of it? Here, as you know, with Schwerpunkt, Schwerpunkt changed my life. It was extremely important for me to do this, because if I hadn't done it, I would have missed so much for myself. I would have not grown. I would never like to be 4 years ago, because the things I learned here, I realized I would have never learned them anywhere, not even at university. There, of course, I could learn other things, but in terms of this capacity of, being, of taking what I learned and being able to explain it to others, and having at this point still some kind of following, and which is increasing. The question is, maybe I'm doing something right, and I like doing it because I think it's useful. I think there is a purpose that, with a meme you still can attract people to that, but let's say, why don't you attract them with something more complex? We would say because they don't understand it. Yeah, but isn't it kind of like, would you like to be treated as a child, rather? Where you are an adult and you should be able to understand complex things, and like that I don't understand. I don't see the level of of tragedy in our lives to vent oneself, spending time on social networks posting memes, which seems to be the new. Look at me, I am of that special group because I post this thing in popular subculture and modernism and medieval things that have nothing to do, in fact, with the Middle Ages or any other historical content. Just a very narrow popular subculture, nothing else. So that it's the idea of greatness that is stressed by the phrase here, Historia, Magistra, Vita, because it's as if history dominated life, and I believe it's correct, because we are all a consequence of history, and until we don't understand that, there's nowhere we can go as mature beings. And the same goes for ourselves. I think that history teaches us many things that are irrelevant for our own the capacity that we have to inquiry on our own selves. This is probably the greatest thing that history can do. I mean, if you're not habituated to research, if you're not curious, if you are really superficial, you don't care, you think that thinking too much is, at least in terms of such prolonged research, not just overthinking what we mean strictly, can be dangerous. But learning is not for you. Chances are that you will never understand yourself at the same time. I don't know whether it's a causal consequence of history, because I did it ever since I was a child, but I am a person, for example, that researches continuously on oneself, right? I've had an easy life, and yet I've never had really traumas, violence, tragedies, dramatic things, accidents, losses, abuse. If you investigate people's personal background, you find the worst things remain sometimes. And it's hard, because you get to know the ones you love, and you realize they're messed up. It's very painful. In fact, this, if anything, happened to me. I realized that, fortunately enough, I was of a different pace, but still, such awareness sometimes you see, those people can live on their lives remaining oblivious of so many things, and maybe because they don't want to learn, they don't want to acknowledge, they can't to run away. I'm not made like this. I have to dissect every single thing that happens to me, even though, again, there may not seem to be any kind of a reason. The reason may be actually that I forced myself into a very strange lifestyle, which is in a sense exemplified by Schwerpunkt as well, but I can assure you it's not the whole thing, and that gives you the dimension actually of how invested I am, generally speaking. I'm never, like, in the moment I wake up to the one I go to sleep, I'm always doing something concrete. Like, I never stop, and this keeps me going, right? And I'm not even a hyperactive sense in the physical and energetic sense. I'm kind of lazy, I don't feel I could do all I could do, right? But I still do it, and especially it never ends. Like, it continues for years and years and years, and sometimes I say, but maybe there's something wrong with me. Turns out there is not, right? I made psychiatric tests when I was in the Navy. I've done some kind of it turns out, yes, I have I have introversion, these things, but I'm not I'm not autistic. I don't have anything of those problems. I really, it's me doing this thing willingly, and maybe I realized that in order to keep that going on, it's because, first of all, I've learned, and this history told me a lot, that you have to stay active, you have to achieve something. That the purpose of life is properly not being happy, but to achieve something, which is usually what you're not told, right? Because that kind of moral dimension is evaporating. Of course, what a person wants to be, if it has no purpose and no sight, no reach, whatever, it's of course what they wanted, the simplest thing, right? I want to kind of be happy at the moment. Translated meaning, not even being happy all the time, because that would be, you'd be confined in a psychiatric asylum. But you properly just not feeling pain, that is to say, basically sheltering yourself from everything, including knowledge, which is always burdensome, but makes you grow up, right? And so you have that kind of minority of which Cicero is talking about, for those that do not really know the world, and do not really know reality, and take, as we were saying before, right, they're kind of obliged to believe that, because out of recognizing that reality would expose them to the misery of their situation. Again, that exactly what was happening sociologically and psychologically under totalitarianisms. So it's as if I had always to go back to that memory that Cicero is talking about, and building up this narrative, historical narrative of myself. What did I go through? What did the whole thing happen for? Like, let's say, at the point where I am arrived, what is that I can do and I can't do? And how much force do I have to do this? How much motivation do I have to do this? Especially, why is this motivation there, right? Is it a good idea, right? Is it a good investment? Am I doing something right? Right? This is a constant inquiry, constant research. Like Cicero or Petrarch, I must tell you, I speak alone most of the times, and that's to to myself and to others, kind of figure it, I don't have imaginary friends, but strictly meant, but let's say I like to, challenge myself dialectically, logically, because I need that clarity for my action. And so history teaches you this, because you see, you cannot really write a stupid history article, because everybody is going to think that you're stupid concept. And so that trains you to articulate some thoughts that are actually what history is beautiful for, because they teach you how to explain reality, and when that makes sense, because it works, because you're actually nailing it, you feel that you understand the usefulness of this, you understand the achievement of it, you understand the fact that you have managed to sort out a piece of reality that through which you can start building up the whole thing. And reality at that point is not going to scare you anymore. In fact, I must say, if anything, that learning history hasn't quite, has given me a much greater confidence towards the world. Maybe not much in the world per se morally, but I mean in the idea of my relation with the world, and yet has challenged me morally ever more. Has made me realize that if I don't act myself, there is hardly anything that I can hope or think. Believe me, it's not easy. Great part of the issues that I told you about that I've had recently have derived exactly from this, that when you're very high in consciousness like me, and something goes wrong after which you had invested yourself thoroughly because you thought it was the right thing, and it fails for some reason, and you do receive some blows that, okay, I took the risk and I was aware of that, but that's the point of history, and that's why I presume most people don't want to learn history, because it's, when you have to struggle against your own belief, it's somewhat painful, or at least you feel the pain of it. It requires a great effort. It requires suffering. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of time. How many people are willing to spend to have all this for, by the way, something that you will never be fully aware of whether you nailed or not, right? The reason why I do this is not really because I want to become, say, famous or rich, or whatever. Like, the idea is that I like learning new stuff. That's what thrills me. And that's all what my historical interest has always been about. I haven't done it for, let's say, another reason, primarily, than that, because I always knew that knowing new stuff would help me for all the other reasons that I could have. And it did, right? Learning history, for example, has brought me to, to learn, to acquire new skills that I used, for example, even for knowing new people, for understanding them, right? I hardly, and unfortunately so, can distinguish now a person from their historical background, and this has been an issue, because actually, I mean, it's been very useful, because it turns out I basically get it right all the time, right? I know what to expect by certain contexts. That's also what it turns out, that people who know more are more prejudiced, and it couldn't be otherwise, right? Prejudices can be accurate statistically, so there is nothing wrong with them, and so you can be prepared to the world. If you really don't have why are younger people so idealistic? Idealist, because of course they don't know the world. They presume it's like the picture that they have made, all that, and then before they get to know it for real, they think it's just the way they, the radical way of seeing it, the world, right? And so it's a way of challenging the same civilization for strengthening it in the process. That is really, in my opinion, connected to the meaning of this phrase. And then the last description is nuntia vetustatis. So essentially the messenger of antiquity, right? We can, yeah, vetustas in Latin has this idea of a, of the elderly, properly, and somebody was seen it before, right? It's the same etymology of veteran, just for that matter, and so it's a messenger of something that has something to teach you in a way itself. Have something that at least can prove you what it means to be out there, what it means what things in the past meant for the people who live in there. And so that also exposes to the obvious realization that humans reasoned in different ways throughout different times. Even in here, never in the radical relativistic sense for which, humans really can't believe whatever they want and adapt accordingly. It doesn't really work like that. There is a biological hardware that cannot be suppressed by any stretch of the imagination. So what actually happens is rather, different conditions. It can be environmental, political, social, culture, and so on, that, however, react essentially on the same human software and hardware, right? So the software naturally is informed by both things, but it's still not alien from reality in any material but also spiritual sense. So studying history does provide you with this sense of what could be somebody's perspective on the issue. I must say, I find it interesting because we tend to make often, perhaps this is the field in which I personally feel, for example, to be more challenged and more more dubious, at least because there is less way to check that, right? Moral forces cannot really be quantified or qualified in. We can't see them, of course. For example, military history presents you with that kind of different, overwhelming pressure to which humans react in comparable ways in the horrors of war and so on. Always realizing that they are the ones who are actually enacting them at the same time. It's never an external terrible factor in which humans are just thrown in. One of the greatest mistakes could ever been done in conceiving war. But properly, we don't know what they thought more than else, right? Because we have just their writings. And even if you interview, somebody in a psychiatric session, you never know what's in that person's mind. Hell, we don't even understand often what's in our own mind. So you can argue how we can know what somebody like Cicero actually reasoned like. But you understand that given that we are speaking, even look at the etymologies here we listed, we're basically speaking the same language, and the whole thing makes sense in a very close way, right? For Westerners reading these passages, it's like feeling home. Excuse me, I drink a little. But how do we know exactly what meanings they attributed to these phrases? And so history helps you actually finding out in a way or another. And I think that this is by far the most underestimated dimension of history, though it's because it's the most difficult, as we just said. But probably the greatest difficulty that we have in understanding history is exactly this one. Because even in here, it's not much about you see, moderns have concentrated on this, concentrating about the the object that was being thought at the time. That is to say, who knows what, I don't know, a 13th century French peasant had in mind from morning to evening. And say, what did they think? Or, of course, we also throw in how they thought like, which is interesting. You even wonder how your cat thinks, right? So, which is fascinating, by the way, because you recognize some kind of, if not of humanity as we intended, but the fact that after all we understand each other because we're similar and we have a lot in common actually, even with animals. So, but what we underestimate is the intensity of the moral dimension. Because you see, in the moment in which we start to reason, who knows what did Charlemagne think and so on, we kind of immediately and unavoidably, in terms of mental, in terms of mindset and etc., we relate those figures, sort of fantasy ones first of all, but even when we know history, in some detail we can't fully and can't really diverge much from that either. We project essentially our own kind of thinking on it. This is true at many levels, also of course for broader interpretations of collective feelings. For example, think about the idea of nation, or it's very dangerous at that point. If you can hardly think what a person thought, what do you know about the entirety? Well, in a sense, history there helps you as well, because it's the same way we do now, right? You don't know what's in other people's heads, but we'll have an idea of how, let's say, what, I don't know, people vote a certain party for. And we can't kind of check that from all the reality that surrounds us, so that even if we don't actually know anything with the degree of certainty that we would like, we kind of understand that though. And we kind of underestimate exactly this autonomy of our, this capacity of our mind to achieve that, because it turns out it does work, and that all human structures or hierarchies are fundamentally functioning like this. The problem, in my opinion, is we have lost the idea of the intensity of the thoughts. That is much more important, because it is something that motivates you, right? Today, we are weaker mentally, and we have to be completely honest about this. You don't have the intelligence and the capacity of a 7th century Bulgar horseman, because the things that people did, by the degree of pressure and overwhelming, risks, assessments, and the exposure to death, violence, suffering, the privations, the scarcity of resources, something that you fortunately will never experience in your life. You really haven't, right? So you can always find a person that is escaping from war, that have seen a lot of things, but not even at that point. You could say, from a 21st century perspective, that given the average living condition, even in those situations, you actually know what it means to live not just the single experiences that should be, first of all, the ones that should immediately make you realize how real this thing is, but properly also how, the mindset that was produced by, a world where, 1/3 of who was born died, for example, before their maturity, in a world where, banally, even things that may seem trivial, when night fell, like it was night, meaning there was literally nothing out there but darkness, and it was a completely different experience, another world, and people were dramatically more wired to nature than we are today. We're much less alienated in this sense from the physical experience. You don't know what that feels. That is to say, even if you do, at this point it's mediated in ways that you're not exposed continuously to, or not in the same ways, and especially it's all mediated for you to not be ever in a condition of, mostly, as it was at the time, of subsistency, of bare subsistency, compared to what you live now, right? So just think, for example, think about there is a blackout. How your mind starts spinning, right? Just because you can't use what you're evidently dependent on in terms of electricity, and what works with it, your mind starts spinning around. So just think what it means, how your mind can spin when you're surrounded by some tribal foes that want to exterminate you and rape your women and torture you, and but then all these things, and how to sort that out. And properly, the physicality you have to properly, it's a moral dimension, right? The physicality has to follow, but just thinking how we are dishabituated to suffer, just physically speaking, in order to achieve certain things. At that point, there were certain things you would have had to sacrifice anyway. And so what I've come to the conclusion of, especially looking at properly the moment in which the pressure is the highest, like in war, so also the warrior war, let's say the war bands, the confraternities, and so on. How the ideologies of this time were dramatically more impacting psychophysically than today's, right? I've made, for example, lots of videos on the Germanic Comitatus, and when I began to study these things, I objectively had never heard, aside from the stereotype of the violent barbarian, that took drugs to be like frenzied and frenetic. What actually stood culturally behind that? The fact that it's hardly any drugs that can cause that can't just be unhelp. You have to be essentially traumatized, destroyed, and recomposed as a human being, or something that at that point is barely not anymore, such that to be able to do the things that those people did. Because there is no other mechanism that today we wouldn't be able to replicate that. Or at least, for those people it was an art, right? And that was the standard situation of, I don't know, if you take Proto-Indo-Europeans, fundamentally they all lead in that kind of appalling level of violence at every single, in every single vein of their culture, in a sense that was functional for their survival. And we cannot understand it anymore. We have, even in the reacquisition, let's say the reconstruction of such things, we have, historically speaking, we have at some point the same scholars that I read, I realized that they haven't brought it to the extreme consequences, meaning that they haven't understood properly, aside from these what maybes or whatever, that realizing what these people did, what did take exactly to be like that. Maybe some other studies will actually point this out, but it's hardly maybe now we're kind of reapproaching the idea. I don't know. I've been talking a lot about it here, and I see those are the most watched videos. Probably some of the ideas some other people are spreading around. That's something that I've never found written, however, anymore. So even certain, you see, this is a knowledge that, by the way, is much closer to us chronologically than we think. Like in the 19th century, even in a very civilized situation, you can pick Britain, France, whatever. I think men and women were much more aware by default of what those, certain symbols, archetypes, and, meanings were actually about than today, right? We are forgetting that. We're not being re-exposed, and on the contrary, we're kind of giving way to, it's not an alternative idea. It's properly the dilution of any kind of moral strength to the ideas that we see today, being, almost enforced on people everywhere as a sort of diktat of what people should think or not think, right? And I'm talking deeply at a cultural level. Of course, it's all political and social, and it's coherent, in fact, to what we understand is going on. But it's not good news, because it means that the individual is actually losing meaning, is losing relevance, is losing substance, quality, value. And if we can be told by history that, something that seems like that is that historically speaking, whenever this happens, usually those individuals succumb, or at least they're brutally exploited, and oppressed, and sometimes suppressed, and there is not really anybody that can do anything for them. That's why it is relevant to consider the antiquity. We read here of the how the phrase says, the nuntia vetustatis, right? The vetustas, something so old, like those books with mold, dust on it, it's boring. We think of something geriatric in the process, I'm sure. The old stuff is just bad. It's just dust. It's things we don't really like it. And instead we don't realize that those traces of the past were actually life, and that you will come to be the same thing pretty soon. And so whatever that thing is now still has a meaning that you should better find if you want to have a shot, to have any kind of responsibility for yourself and the others. And again, this doesn't seem to be quite received. Sometimes there are some anecdotes that I'm amazed by. At this point when I meet people like that. I don't know. I found, for example, I tell you just recently. This was surely this was she was a girl in her mid-20s or something, right? Today from, I don't remember where. I have an idea, but anyhow, we're talking about, I don't know, it came about the name Philip, and this person basically said, this was a Westerner, by the way. So think about this, that the name. So first of all, you've never even heard a name that is common in your own country, which is weird. And secondly, but the thing is, she said, so Philip, in my opinion, comes from the Philippines. So this was a Westerner in 2021, in her mid-20s or more, that actually believed that the name Philip is derived from the Philippines. Then I told her that that's actually because the Philippines were Spanish and were named after Philip II of Spain, and she said, so now I understand, right? So this is not just ignorance, right? This is stupidity. It's different, you see. Because it's not just that you don't know something, it's that you make a wrong equation and you decide arbitrarily that for no reason whatsoever that has any sense. If not, in that case, the etymological meaning, but just because. Why? Because there is a country's name like that. It's like it's a severe issue, right? I cannot think if this person votes, will raise children. It will happen. It does happen, but let's say, don't you think it's a tragedy, right? And this is maybe just an anecdote, but believe me, that goes with so much worse than that, because I'm sure that if I had just investigated further, because as you understand, I didn't have even a much greater conversation after that statement, but if I had investigated further, you would be the same. How many books do you read? How much do you know about other countries? What do you do with your life? How do you react to the idea that you should be constantly challenging you to be a better self for yourself and the others? This is like zero, right? And this is what I've been meeting constantly at this point, without any this complete exposure to the world without any purpose, that I personally find frightening. I mean, not because of me, because I know that I'm with that now standardly, right? I've built myself that way, so there is hardly any way I can change that, because it's something I measured scientifically on the base of a lot of time spent checking this stuff, and I realized that not everybody can do the same thing, not even in the same way, as we've seen talking about history in their respective fields of expertise that they have. But that is the standard idea, is living without meaning. Living without a purpose that is constructive, is comprehensive, is something dominating and powerful, and something that you strive to achieve because you understand the inherent benefit and reward and improvement that it derives from. It's frightening, but it's beautiful. This is history, mistress of life, right? It's properly, you research constantly because that's your duty as a moral being, as a human being, because there's no other thing around for it works like this and makes things. And people live and die on the basis of the decisions taken, right? So if you want to have some kind of, appreciation towards yourself, you cannot live without this kind of exposure. And to me, let's say, the majority of the world's problem I realize may derive from this. I mean, I can understand you may, let's say, everything should be known. I think scientific education is extremely low. Even in there, before we're talking about, history university professors wasting their times posting, I don't know, thousands of, memes on Instagram. That thing struck me particularly. But here we can talk about, and I've met lots of other persons like this, that on Facebook, whatever, that were sharing constantly scientific posts, so-called, that fit in the category of, science by subject, right, by typology of post. And there's not hardly anything scientific. You know that kind of bullshit that circulates like in memes on those enormous groups with, people just share without even understanding what the hell that means or whether that even makes sense. They're pseudo-scientific, right? Just like there is too much pseudo-history and there is some lesson there and bias and problems that are not grasped more than much, then, you always have the subtle mind that reaches there, so it's not really a desolated wasteland. But it's this idea of, buying, for example, in the internet, you're intelligent because you deal with science. So you must be a very advanced person because you share scientific-based memes, and these are kind of ridiculous. And maybe you ask this person about even just the principles of dynamics, they don't even know, how to list them. So at that point, you understand it's a masquerade, right? It's not anything concrete. It's not a matter of tastes or opinions, of diversity, of, freedom of thought. It's garbage, right? And and as such, we should just throw it away. But go teach those people about this and see what you can do, right? And why don't they know, right? Because their states are failed, their school systems are failed, their moral systems are failed. How do you fix that? Because we all live in the same place at the end of the day, so it's a common problem. What are you going to do about that? And again, history can't really teach us how to do it if we listen to it, if we lend an ear, but more than that, to really sort things out the way they deserve to be sorted out. It's always an approximation. You never arrive at the end, right? You never stop to the point you say, okay, this is satisfactory. As historians, we have the embarrassment of saying, you see, a physicist in a laboratorium arrives to a certain number after a lot of struggle, and he or she can say, okay, formally, I'm done here, right? A historian doesn't have this limit. That's why it's really important in terms of also, why history is so important on the base of such arbitrium that you have, that exposes you to the necessity of the fact that all our knowledge, doesn't matter which subject comes from, is approximate in a way or another. Well, history forces you to recognize more than any other field, in a sense, the responsibility that you have saying the word stop, right? You could say, but also in other fields, even in hard sciences, it's kind of like this, because after all, it's still about the knowledge that you decide to to set as a but history has no grounds, and yet these grounds are essentially encompassing the whole human spectrum, mostly in the Clausewitz and Trinity one of politics, war, and society. So whatever it is, it's not just about standing on on the brink of discovery, let's say, and making that punctual difference in saying, okay, maybe I make it or not. This is a never-ending process that, however, you have to modulate according to the situation, and Wu does teach you that, because it's a bit like politics. It's a bit like what reality, in fact, in history is made like. That if you study history in detail, it's about very contingental choices sometimes, because we can, why? Because we cannot predict things either, right? So there is always a responsibility, of a scientist of finding out something. But again, at that point, once the thing is discovered, is measured, etc., that passes to somebody else. Also for historians, it's like this. But the point is that, political, strategic analysts and so on, so they still base themselves in theory on some kind of historical understanding. And these are people that do not know whether in 4 months the world will go nuts for some reason, because it's unpredictable. Whereas, if you're going to discover some important scientific feat, right, you can argue. I mean, think about Faraday, think about Maxwell, think about Einstein, etc. Those are people that essentially discovered something that changed the world, but discovered something in a, let's say, in an inherent dimension that at the time, of course, was seen, because also in science you never know. Actually, they up to that point, there were things that had troubled scientists that they solved or confirmed, but they and they opened to something else. But let's say the spectrum of let's say, scientifically speaking, what this gets to is an acknowledgement that, after all, remains there. Because when they decided to fix the atom, what they discovered that, but somebody else took that, of course, for at that point, it were 1942 to project properly the bomb and to use it. And you can argue that it's a much more challenging decision to decide to use an atomic weapon than even working a lifetime to discover how to make it work. Not in the sense that the consequence of what the scientists did were not big, and therefore what the person did was not morally challenging in that sense. But you can argue that that thing at that point would have been discovered by somebody else at the same time. So that already makes the challenge, but let's say the scientist is not the one who launches the bomb. And at that point, the Americans were struggling against, the Axis, and they were trying, also with to properly arrive first to achieve something that, fortunately speaking, was, dramatically positive for the world. And that somebody else would have, if they're not competed, it would have been, at that point, it would have been too late. For so many things that we give for granted, even in the world that we formed about after World War II. So measuring that, yes, is dramatically more difficult and challenging and overwhelming than managing how to make an atom decay. And it's because you can't know how it's going to go, and so you have to measure. There is no laboratorium equation that will tell you whether to do it or not. You have to measure it on the basis of a political, military, and social experience that you have no other guide for but history. And it's an extremely precarious equilibrium. But again, it must be understood, because those swings can make the difference literally between something horrifying for the entire civilization or not. So fortunately, we live in a world where, properly the organizational structures have arrived to the, the hierarchies have understood that there must be some kind of joint decision. There must be some safety measures, protocols, etc., that for which we will have to avert the worst. But the worst can arrive in ways that, as we have just witnessed, are not even predictable. If we would think that the pandemic would occur, many scientists that describe perfectly before what would have happened, because this thing was we already had so many warnings in the previous decades, but we've been disgustingly lucky with this pandemic, because the thing had killed like 1 person out of 10 of whoever got sick. I mean, it would have been the end of the world, quite literally meant. The same goes for, there are so many viruses around. Nobody gives a damn. Where those pass to animals, I've seen there's some deer that basically get eaten alive by the virus, and this thing cannot be killed. There's no way to sterilize the objects that get in contact with this thing. So it basically means that if this passes on to human, we have to start shooting down people. And the same goes for the avian flu. The avian influenza. It turns out, look at what in Israel are doing just in these days, because it seems that there are thousands of cranes. This is already passed to chickens and chicken farms in the tens of thousands. And there are so many cases here in Europe. We've seen in Britain, France, Czech Republic, Slovenia. It's basically everywhere at this point. If that passes on to human, it's freaking. That's the H1N1, if I'm not wrong. That's serious problems. It's going to be much worse than COVID. But banally, if you worry even about these things, thinking about solar storms. I mean, those things, if in the late 19th century, it was something like that, at the time, society was much more rudimental. It didn't affect us more than much. But if it happened now, everything electric is done. So if you worry about these kind of things, just be aware that you can have all your preconceptions on how economics should work or whatever, but the truth is that nobody has the freaking idea of what can happen in such a situation. And you said, oh, well, but that's an extraordinary event. Yes, go tell it before the pandemic struck. And that changes reality, because it's reality we're talking about. And I remember I made a video at the beginning of the pandemic last year that was like, I will have to re-upload it, because it was one of the ones I'm re-uploading. The mindset in face of a pandemic, and I usually abandon myself to this kind of rambling, say preaching or something like that. And I said, you'll see what consequence this will bring. And there was a person there who was into economics. I don't know if he's still following. He said, well, come on, it won't happen to anything because we have the money, everything will go back into. This is not about the money. This is about, it's also about the money, but it's about the money not because of the market in itself. I mean, of course, it starts from there, but exactly because it starts from what the people do, right? If the electricity now is double price, if so many other issues that are connected to that morally, politically, and socially affect the change in the world does change, and it changes in unpredictable ways. In ways that you cannot, more or less, yes, we see here, we don't envisage really, a very likely disaster of some sort. But what the hell can we know how these factors will interfere with others that we even have no idea of? And that we literally have no idea of, because again, we don't study history, we don't study the world, we don't know how it works, right? It's not that we can't predict that. History cannot help us predicting the future in that sensible fashion. It's if not in a politically approximate way, usefully speaking. But we are aware of the fact that we should be way more deadly serious about what is going on than what we are, and much more aware, much more interested in learning and in having that kind of understanding and interest in searching for the truth, even if we can't reach it, but still getting closer to that and making the world better. Without history, this is impossible. It's just like we are like those cranes with the virus now that are going in circle, crazy and die because they don't have a purpose anymore. They don't understand anything anymore. And anything valuable to what we need at this level of civilizational development that we can't even control anymore. And it's scary because we know how devastating we can be. So it's a big deal. And that's why history, I do agree that history is Magistra vitae, because it really is the only field that can give you that practical insight, not on one branch or another, but on the whole, that gives you a sort of wisdom, a sort of sensitivity that you can't even quite, express if not by judging historical situations. And so therefore anything that we know, what we think is the present, and that should be much more evaluated and properly, let's say, appreciated for its intrinsic quality, its unique characteristic that we don't see really in any other subject, that I believe. In any case, for today, this is all. I want to make the usual salute because this is the last video of the year. There is actually one thing I wanted to tell you that I think what did history teach you? What can be the greatest teaching in this matter, given that it's the last day of the year and that we're leaving behind something maybe unpleasant for many reasons, not just the pandemic, but at least in my case, it's the case. In this, that, as we just say, we can never predict what is going to happen. So, of course, you have my best wishes of a fantastic, happy, beautiful, pleasant, loving 2022. And I really mean it because I feel for humanity. I'm a fan of humanity, even if I don't express it more than much, because I have all my perplexities. I know that we are good and evil at the same time, because we do right and wrong things. But you are, let's say, my followers. I do this thing for you at the end of the day, even though I do it for me too, really. And so I want to think that what I say maybe has a minimal impact on what you may be willing to do. Not because I tell you what to do, but because you understand something that maybe I don't even understand from my own speech, that can give you another perspective, another insight, and something that you care, maybe you integrate with a much better understanding that I have, but that can help, that this we can't reciprocate the sharing of knowledge, of history, and that's important. To me, history has taught a lot of things, and maybe this is the topic of another video that I will make if you're interested. These are unending ideas that I can have for especially these historian rambles and so on. In fact, the playlist is called like that, for the historical value, as you understand. But there is one thing I would like to stress, even it's not maybe the happiest, right, as I was saying before, but it's not a problem. As we've seen, happiness is not really meant to be the end of life. But history taught me probably the harshest of lessons. That is, history has to teach you to let go. which doesn't mean to give up or to, let's say, abandon your purpose or whatever. But there is a moment. We made a video. It was last year, etc. It was definitely in a better situation than now. And I thought I was talking about the relative value of victory and defeat. You see, in everything we do, of course, there is a value of some sort for our improvement, and then there are certain things that simply go wrong sometimes, and this can bring us down, especially when we invested, we committed ourselves so much into something. This end of the year is maybe a moment of recollection of what you achieved, what you didn't, what you want to achieve in the future, etc. Letting go sometimes is it's a form of reconciliation with yourself. It's not having failed or having been defeated or being marked by this, but it's properly realizing, as Cicero was saying, that there is a past, right? And we don't live in it anymore, whether we like it or not. Yes, we technically live in the past because we technically live in reality in the moment which this has just passed. So it's a neurocognitive reality, and we can't do anything about that. But let's say in the past, it becomes ever more past, right? And so something that we cannot reach again. There is something in history, perhaps, is the illusion of escaping death, in a way. It's the idea. There are other sayings that say, if you study history, it's as if you lived many more lives than the ones you did. I don't think this is really. I mean, in part it is, but it's not all. Let's say, but it can be very useful. But let's say there are certain things that we look at in the past, in history, that we wish we would have done better. We wish we had, or simply in general, we wish they had gone in a different way. And some of these things can be very painful, but very painful, especially losses of any kind. That's probably the hardest thing you can have. There is much worse than that, unfortunately. Let's not talk about it, but let's say there is a moment when you can, you see, it's important for a person, I presume, to never to leave unfinished business, ideally, right? Or not to have given up, not to have not taken that chance to do what they really wanted. In the past year, and maybe a bit more, I've been pushing a lot for the idea that you should act, right? You should achieve, you should go there, bringing to the ultimate consequence, which is never ultimate. And because you could, in theory, go on forever, right? With trying something. There are certain things that, most of the things we abandon, right? Some succeed, some get to the end, right? And we, as humans, in fact, try to mediate it, right? There are many things that, I don't know, this year I got my doctoral title. So I'm officially, I have the Schwerpunkt for Tolkien history from a, I don't really, I'm proud of that for how it happened, but let's say, as you know, I don't care about the title in itself. But surely, you see, that was a mediated activity. There are other things that, when you succeed in those formally recognized ones, that you don't really, that were more important for you, and are legitimately more important sometimes because they have to do with your life, and sometimes we find it difficult to give up. We remain stuck, we fixate, we say, that thing should have gone different, I should do something. Then you realize this thing is really consuming for you, and so there is a point at which you should be able to let go, which doesn't mean to forget or to even let the thing completely go, as far as properly, the possibility of something changing could happen, because history, in fact, teaches us exactly this, that we can never know. But we should always be able to reason comprehensively, in as much we can, of course, be more productive for ourselves by letting something go, right? And everything that we do to achieve something is by losing something else. It's just about the importance of this something else that we have to assess. And sometimes it's really hard. And sometimes we don't see how important or unimportant something it is, because we make a lot of mistakes in our mind. We misassess, right? So the important is not to have a tunnel vision. It's not to remain stuck at some point where you can't even distinguish, the reason why you're doing it anymore, right? Don't fixate on things that go wrong, even if you wanted them, even if it is something that really has a deep meaning for you. There is a victory in being able to let go, as long as you have surely tried your best and you have done what seemed right, and you have maybe failed even in there. It's been even worse at some point, but you at least have learned something, and so that lesson learned is part of history. It's part of your history. It's part of what you can know about yourself when things go wrong, right? So letting go the worst of it, or at least what really oppresses you, takes you down, and makes you feel miserable, right? Just know it's not worth it, because you're much better than that. And it's this is one of the hardest lessons that I have learned from history, especially this year. I completely disagree with my own advice itself, meaning that I still keep pursuing the same thing, in a way, and I know that I will gradually, let go, right? But I just can't accept it now, and that's also fine, right? That's, as long as you can, you should try, right? If you think that it's really important, you are the only person who gives the meaning. But in this sense, be aware, be aware of it. Be aware of what you choose, and don't think that reality fits what you expected just because of your dreams. Reality doesn't work like that. So being exposed to it more, being more aware of itself, and studying history, and broadening your horizons and your critical skills and so on is crucial to be able to give a new dimension to things, and to see them in the right perspective, without making, without even in there trying to picture them in a way that they really weren't. But let's say the more you expand, the more you step forward, and the more you will be able to comprehend that, and to understand that you can't do much more if you really let yourself try, that you can get even more than that. It's hard sometimes. It's hard because it can be really the last chance. It could have been really a great opportunity that was lost or something. But at the same time, you may never know, right? And I know that you can't just be content of something that is not there yet, and that you're not even sure whether it will ever appear. But still, as something like that happened to you at some point, you should realize that it could happen again, or there may be, and there surely is something better than that, and that it takes a lot of work to find out. So don't let yourself being, crippled by that specific obsession, right? And show yourself you're stronger than that. There is a lot of self realization and improvement, and appreciation at the end of the day, because of that. In any case, I wish you again a happy 2022. We'll see each other on the other side. Thank you very much for listening again. Have a great new year. Bye.